The Atlantic Ocean in early 1942 was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. While the American public was still reeling from the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor, a silent, predatory shadow had reached the eastern seaboard. They called it Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag. To the German U-boat commanders, men like Admiral Karl Dönitz, it was the second happy time. But to the merchant sailors of the Allied nations, it was a descent into a cold, watery hell. Imagine standing on a beach in New Jersey in February. The air is a jagged blade of frost. Just beyond the horizon, the night sky is bruised with the orange glow of burning oil tankers. This wasn't a war fought in far-off lands. This was a war happening within sight of the boardwalks. In January and February alone, nearly 200 ships, vessels carrying the lifeblood of the free world, steel, grain, and high-octane fuel, were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. The U-boats were no longer ghosts. They were wolves in a sheepfold, and the American Navy was effectively toothless. At 04:17 a.m. on February 14, 1942, a day meant for lovers became a day for hunters. At Lakehurst Naval Air Station, the massive hangar doors creaked open, revealing the humped silver silhouette of a K-class airship. This wasn't a weapon of speed or brute force. It was a 252-foot envelope of rubberized silk and hope. Inside the cramped, vibrating control car, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Mills watched the needle of his oil pressure gauge dance. Beneath him, 4 Mark 17 depth charges hung like heavy, lethal fruit. The challenge wasn't just the enemy. It was the physics of the mission. The Navy called this coastal patrol, a sterile term for a suicide mission. The K-class Blimp was a massive, slow-moving target with no armour and a top speed that a stiff headwind could cut in half. Yet it possessed the one thing a destroyer didn't: patience. It could loiter. It could hover over the grey swells for 12, 18, even 22 hours, its Pratt & Whitney engines humming a low, rhythmic dirge. The crews didn't call it patrolling. They called it hunting ghosts in the wind. They were looking for a splinter of wood, a shimmer of oil, or the white wake of a periscope, the only clues left by a killer that could vanish in seconds. As Mills pushed the throttle forward and felt the airship lift into the pre-dawn darkness, he wasn't just flying a machine. He was becoming the eyes of a blind nation. In March 1942, the salvation of the American coastline wasn't being plotted in Washington, but in a cathedral of steel in Akron, Ohio. This was the Goodyear Air Dock, the largest building on Earth, without a single internal pillar. Inside this 1,175-foot-long void, the air was perpetually cold, and the silence was heavy with the ghosts of the past. For Carl Arnstein, Goodyear's chief engineer, this mission was a chance at redemption. In the 1930s, Arnstein had designed the USS Akron and the USS Macon, colossal, rigid airships built with internal skeletons of duralumin. Both had ended in tragedy, plunging into the sea and taking dozens of brave sailors to their watery graves. The world said the age of the airship was dead. Arnstein believed the world was wrong. The problem wasn't the airship, it was the bones. The new K-class would have no bones. It was a blimp, a non-rigid vessel that held its shape through the internal pressure of helium alone. If a rigid airship was a skyscraper, the K-class was a high-tech balloon of war. Arnstein promised the Navy 134 of these grey ghosts in just 36 months. It was a staggering commitment. To achieve it, he had to transform a craft that was once handmade, like a tailored suit, into a mass-produced weapon, rolling off the line every 8 days like a Ford Model T. Every K-class required 250,000 square feet of rubberized cotton. This wasn't just fabric. It was a multi-layered shield that had to be airtight, weather-resistant, and light enough to defy gravity. In the Goodyear halls, thousands of workers, mostly women, operated under the glow of heat lamps, stitching miles of seams and coating panels with liquid latex. The air was thick with the acrid, dizzying smell of scorched rubber and solvent. Arnstein stalked the floor with a stopwatch, obsessed with the rhythm of steel. He watched as the control cars, weighing 600 pounds, were bolted to the massive envelopes. He oversaw the installation of the twin Pratt & Whitney R1340 engines, radial beasts that had to run for 20 hours straight without ceasing. Each rivet, each valve, each drop of rubber cement was a battle against time. Arnstein knew that a pin-sized leak in Akron meant a crew falling out of the sky over the Atlantic. He was no longer just an engineer. He was the architect of a silent army, turning a tyre factory into the front line of the war for the waves. By mid-1942, the men of Akron had traded their factory coveralls for army olive drab, leaving behind a vacuum of labour that threatened to derail the entire Airship program. To fill it, Goodyear opened its gates to an army of a different kind, the women of Ohio. They weren't just Rosie the Riveter archetypes. They were the steel heart of the American defense machine. Women like Marie Kowalski, a 23-year-old who had never touched a welding torch before Pearl Harbor, and Margaret Flynn, a mother of two who became the ultimate gatekeeper of quality. Life inside the air dock was a relentless 60-hour-a-week grind. The air was a toxic cocktail of solvent fumes and the smell of vulcanized rubber. Marie Kowalski spent 10 hours a day in a shower of white-hot sparks, welding the aluminum struts that formed the skeletal frame of the control cars. One slip, one moment of fatigue, and a structural flaw would be baked into the ship. "We didn't think about the war in the Pacific," Marie would later recall. "We thought about the boy from down the street who was flying over the Atlantic. If our weld snapped, he didn't come home." The precision required was maddening. Margaret Flynn, the inspector, carried calipers that measured to the thousandth of an inch. She checked every helium valve, every pressure seal, every seam of the 250,000 square feet of fabric. A single pinhole, invisible to the naked eye, could bleed a Blimp's buoyancy until it became a 250-foot coffin of lead. Margaret rejected panels without mercy. To her, a flawed panel wasn't just waste, it was treason. These women worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, sleeping in dormitories where the rumble of the factory never stopped. They suffered from solvent sickness, a constant nauseating vertigo caused by inhaling the glues used to bond the rubberized cotton. Their hands were etched with scars from hot presses and sharp aluminum shards. They were paid 77 cents an hour, a fraction of what the men had earned, yet they bought war bonds with every paycheck. They didn't have medals, but they had the knowledge that every Ayton guy, a silver giant, rolled out of the hangar doors because they refused to quit. By the time the final K134 was delivered, these women hadn't just built machines. They had stitched together the safety of a continent, one seam and one weld at a time. By late 1942, the Atlantic had become a vast, featureless chessboard, and the K-class airships were the only pieces that refused to blink. But let's be clear, flying a blimp wasn't an adventure. It was an ordeal of psychological and physical endurance. Inside the gondola, there were no heaters. At 3,000 feet, the temperature plunged below freezing. Men wore heavy sheepskin jackets, but the cold was a persistent ghost, numbing fingers and fogging the glass until the horizon vanished. A typical patrol lasted 18 to 22 hours. Imagine staring at the rhythmic, slate-grey swell of the ocean for a full day and night, looking for something that didn't want to be found. The crews suffered from what they called Atlantic trance, a state of sensory deprivation where the brain, starved of stimuli, began to invent phantoms. Pilots reported seeing periscopes that turned out to be driftwood, or lifeboats full of survivors that evaporated as they approached. Lieutenant Edward Harris once wrote, "The sea plays tricks on a tired mind. After 15 hours, you don't just see submarines, you pray for them just to prove you aren't going crazy." But on April 3rd, 1943, for the crew of K-23, the Ghost became flesh and steel. Cruising 70 miles southeast of Cape May, the lookout spotted it. A thin, straight wake cutting through the whitecaps. A Type 6 Big Sea U-boat, shallow and vulnerable, likely preparing to surface for a battery charge. Lieutenant Paul Griffin didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle, the Pratt & Whitney engine screaming as the blimp dove toward the kill zone. The U-boat captain spotted the silver shadow and executed an emergency dive. But the K-class was built for this exact moment of sluggish desperation. Griffin levelled off at 500 feet, the airship buffeted by the blast of the rising sea. Mark, the first depth charge, fell. It tumbled through the air, trailing a thin plume of smoke, and vanished into the green abyss. 10 seconds. 15. Then the ocean floor seemed to rise. A massive column of white water erupted 200 feet into the sky, shaking the gondola like a toy. When the mist cleared, a dark, viscous slick began to spread. The lifeblood of a dying U-boat. There were no survivors. In that moment, the grey ghost had proven its lethality. The Germans began to fear the Blimps, not for their speed, but for their relentless, hovering presence. You could outrun a destroyer, but you couldn't hide from a ghost that refused to leave. August 1945. The world's greatest fire was finally being extinguished. As the guns fell silent and the U-boat pens in France were occupied by Allied troops, the Navy began the cold, bureaucratic process of tallying the cost of victory. For the K-class airship fleet, the numbers weren't just impressive, they were statistically impossible. Between 1942 and 1945, these silver giants had flown over 37,000 combat patrols. They had escorted more than 70,000 merchant ships through the most dangerous waters on the planet. But one single statistic stands above all others. A record unmatched by any destroyer, any bomber, or any radar station. Not a single ship in a convoy escorted by a US Navy blimp was ever sunk by a submarine. Not one. The blimps weren't the biggest killers of the war, but they were the ultimate guardians. They didn't just fight a war, they prevented a massacre. But the reward for perfection was obsolescence. Almost as soon as the ink on the surrender documents dried, the Navy began to deflate the very machines that had watched over their sailors. By 1947, the K-class fleet was being dismantled for scrap. The Goodyear Air Dock in Akron, once a thundering cathedral of industrial defiance, grew quiet. The smell of scorched rubber lingered in the rafters, but the overhead cables were empty. Carl Arnstein lived until 1974, reaching the age of 90. He spent his final years in the quiet shadows of retirement, haunted to the end by the failures of the Aran and the Macon. He rarely spoke of the K-class success, considering it simply work that functioned. But his legacy lived on in the letters tucked away in his study. handwritten notes from pilots like James Connolly, who wrote, "You built us a ship that took 3 bullets and still flew. That's the only lead why I'm writing this." The women who built these giants, Marie, Dorothy, Margaret, returned to their civilian lives. Most never mentioned their time in the air dock, their hands scarred from welding and their ears ringing from the factory roar. Yet, in their old age, some kept a single faded photograph, a silver whale suspended in a steel hanger. Margaret Flynn, who inspected every valve on K-47, left a note for her sons before she passed. It made it home. Today, the K-class airships are gone, their envelopes recycled, and their engines long since rusted away. But when you look out over the Atlantic at dawn, and the light catches the mist in a way that looks like a silver shadow, remember the grey ghosts. They were the patient watchers, the tireless sentinels who stayed aloft when everyone else had to land. They proved that in the face of a hidden enemy, the greatest weapon isn't always the one that strikes the hardest. It's the one that refuses to look away.